everybody. My name is Kris. I am the owner of Distilling Now Consulting. We're a consulting business that helps new distilleries and existing distilleries get up and going and grow and overcome a lot of the challenges and problems that come with the day-to-day running of a distillery. A little background on myself. I used to work as a distiller for several years and distillery manager before I started a consulting business to help other distilleries get going and get started up. And have been running my consulting business for a few years now and have had the opportunity to help a lot of really great people get their business started up and going, and also help some other really great people expand their business, which is a challenge that I've heard from many distilleries that they deal with as they start to find success and traction sales of their products, is to grow their business. And so the purpose of my webinar today and what I'll be covering is talking first about what it looks like to grow the production within your business to meet the demands of the products that are in your market today and tomorrow and a few years from now. And furthermore, to talk about how you go about doing so. The way that I see most people going about doing it and growing the production within their business when one or two or three batch stills aren't able to produce enough product to meet the needs for the business is the addition of a continuous column still, which has a much greater output than most batch stills. And so what we're going to talk about today in our webinar is what is continuous distillation, how does it compare to batch distillation, and why continuous distillation is something that you may want to be considering for your distillery, whether you're a brand new startup that wants to make a whole lot of spirits, or you're an existing distillery that needs to be producing more spirits than you currently have the capacity for, and you want to try to do it in a way that is smart, good use of your money, and has the capacity to continue to grow with your business, which is often a ceiling that many distilleries run into with batch distillation, in that they are limited by the capacity of their equipment to grow. So what I'm going to be doing today is doing a presentation that'll cover a lot of the different topics that I've talked about. As we're going through this, I love for these things to be collaborative and have some great discussion and be able to answer people's questions as I'm going through things. So on your Zoom, there should be a box on the bottom that says Q&A. That Q&A box is what we're going to use for people to ask questions. So as you're watching this, if you do have questions, please type them in there, and I should be able to get them visually here and be able to read your question and then try to help answer it so that I can help fill some of the gaps in knowledge that you're looking for to have a better understanding of continuous distillation and give consideration of it to see if it might be a good fit for you in your business. So with all that said, shout out to American Distilling Institute for putting these things together. Really happy here to be given a webinar to talk more about continuous distillation and growing your business and how to do it the smart way. And let's go ahead and dive right into it. So let's talk a little bit about it. We're going to grow through continuous column distillation today. Again, my name is Kris Bohm. I'm from Distilling Now Consulting. We're a consulting business that helps distilleries, new and mature, grow their business and take things to the next level. And continuous columns just happen to be an aspect of distillation that I know really well through the experience of putting a few of them together and running them, and want to try to share some of that knowledge today. The first question that really comes up for many people I've talked to when they're considering continuous column distillation is, are you ready to grow? In many instances, distilleries get up and going and they reach a level where they can no longer produce enough product to meet their demand. And that's typically when the owners and the managers and the distillers start saying, are we ready to grow? Do we need to take that next step to add more equipment, increase capacity, take some sort of step forward to meet the demand that we have going on here? And with those kind of considerations, The other portion of considerations that often come up is in growth, how do we do so in a way that's efficient? Oftentimes, folks will take a look at batch distillation and come upon the notion that it may not be the most efficient way to continue to do what we're doing as we need to grow the output within our business. Which then leads to the third point that many folks come to when they're considering growth is, what is continuous distillation? Many folks know that all the bigger distilleries out there, for the most part, utilize continuous distillation in their production. And how does it work? And how does it compare to what many smaller distilleries are currently doing, which is batch distillation or batch distillation like through a hybrid still that may not be the most efficient way to go about it. Today in our talk, we're going to talk a little bit about how we measure production efficiency within a distillery so that you can better understand and quantify the difference in efficiency between a continuous column still and a batch still so that for your business, you can better give consideration to the variables to make the decision if you're ready to grow. We're further going to dive into it and really do an apples to apples comparison of continuous versus batch distillation so that you can see the differences in inputs and outputs and understand them as they relate to your business. And the last point that we really want to touch on, and I think is very important and often not given enough consideration in distillation, is the necessary safeties. When you're making several hundred gallons of flammable liquid every day in a facility, having the safeties in place to mitigate those risks is very important, cannot be understated. So let's talk a little bit about distillery production growth. As I've seen many distilleries in the past few years come up against, they're selling aged spirits and they're seeing growth in their sales that outpace their current production, which is majorly a problem because when you've spent so much money on production, time, and sales and marketing to get established within a market, to come to the realization that you don't have the capacity to fill that demand as it continues to grow is not just problematic, it can be catastrophic for the business. In many instances, distilleries are at a place where they need more aged spirits to sustain their brand growth, and sourcing spirits from another distillery isn't a path that that particular distillery wants to go down. Taking time to forecast your production to meet growth is so critical to long-term success. You have to have a good idea of where you're going to be next year and even 2 years from now in your sales to be prepared to meet the demand, as there are some distilleries that are seeing 100% growth in sales year over year, and forecasting to be prepared for that is essential. And so now's the time to ask yourself, will you have enough whiskey to meet future demand? If you're not sure, the answer is probably no. And now's a good time to start thinking and preparing about it. So, the first answer that everyone comes to is that we need to increase our output if we're going to grow. A continuous column is the most efficient way to produce large quantities of spirit. There is a reason that every bourbon distillery in Kentucky that has large output almost exclusively uses continuous column distillation to do so. It's efficient. It can produce immense amount of spirits and it's scalable, which is not so much the case with batch distillation. One of the questions that often comes up to me when I talk to folks about continuous distillation is, can't you only make bourbon, or can't you only make vodka on a continuous column still, or can I produce the same spirit on a continuous column I'm currently making on my batch distillation system? And for the most part, the answer is yes. You can produce almost any type of spirit on a continuous column still and yield a product that is similar in character to what's distilled off a batch still. Now, I will say they're not identical. When things are batch distilled, the flavor profile is different than what comes off of a continuous column. But with that said, there are so many more upsides to running a continuous column that having a small change in the flavor profile of your spirits is not going to be nearly as detrimental to your distillation program as not having any whiskey to sell. And I can't stress it enough that literally nearly every large whiskey distillery in North America uses continuous column distillation. And there's a lot of consideration that should be given to that if your business wants to grow to that next level. The other thing with continuous columns that is important to talk about is that the equipment can be designed and sized to meet the desired output. Continuous columns can be built fairly small in diameter to massive in diameter, with the size and the output as the column is larger in size increases exponentially. It's unlikely that your distillery needs to be producing over 1,000 barrels of whiskey a day, like the folks at Heaven Hill. But it could very well be that your distillery needs to be doing, 1,000 or 2,000 barrels a year to be in a good position to grow your brand over the next 5 years. And so continuous column distillation equipment can be sized to meet the needs of the business today and also have the capacity to grow into. What we're going to do now is we're going to kind of do a little side by side comparison of what a typical batch still can do versus a continuous column still. I think you already know my opinion on which one is better, but let's actually break down the two and talk through the differences so that you can literally see the numbers and why I think they're better. For our example here, we're going to look at a fairly simple batch still, in that you have two pot stills working together, 1,000-gallon still for stripping, one 300-gallon still for finishing. So this is whiskey that's being double distilled. You have a mash cooker that's cooking 1,000 gallons of mash every day, and then you have the stills running at the same time. With a setup like this is typically going to be about a 10-hour day of operation that's requiring 3 people to work in there to make the equipment. And at the end of the day, those folks should have about 3 barrels of whiskey if you have an efficiency of yielding about 4 proof gallons per bushel of grain you're putting in. These numbers can vary a little bit, but this is an average of what I've found through the many distilleries that I've been through. And that's our typical batch distillation system we're looking at. Now, let's change gears and let's look at what a typical continuous column distillation operation would look like of comparable size. So in our case here, we have an 18-inch continuous column and a mash cooker that's cooking 3,600 gallons of mash every day. Now, when that mash is done fermenting, we've got about a 10-hour day of work ahead of us of distillation. And in that 10-hour day, this little 18-inch continuous column could yield an output of upwards of 500 proof gallons in a day. Now, if you count the difference in barrels there, you'll see it's a lot. For a single day of labor and input, you have a lot more whiskey rolling out the door at the end of the day. And the other difference is that a continuous column is more efficient at extracting ethanol out of a product. And so you actually get a higher yield per bushel. And so you make more whiskey for the same amount of grain, in essence. Big difference here in the output between one and the other. And what's also important to stress here is it requires about the same amount of energy to heat a continuous column as it does that 1,000-gallon still. And so you're going to spend less on your gas bill operating a system like this with a much higher output. And so you're going to reduce your overall cost of production and have better economies of scale in your production. There's a lot of upsides to running a continuous versus a batch at this sort of scale. So let's shift gears now. Let's talk a little bit about continuous column still theory and how the stills operate. The way that a continuous column operates is very different from a batch still or even a batch still with a hybrid column next to it, where you're doing like a single pass distillation. One of the biggest hurdles that I often hear from folks when they're considering a continuous column is that a continuous column operates differently from a batch still, and that uncertainty in how they operate is challenging to folks who already have an established process that they like and they work well. And learning how to operate a continuous still is completely different than a batch still. So I'm going to talk through a little bit sort of what the steps are in a continuous still while we do a side-by-side comparison of what that means in translation, that what happens in a batch still. Continuous column stills are continually fed mash. They operate in a constant state of temperature equilibrium. And so there is constantly mash coming into the still and constantly whiskey coming out. Now, unlike a batch still where what gets distilled out of it is your heads, your hearts, and your tails throughout a process throughout the day, in a continuous still, the whiskey coming off of the still is finished. The heads and the tails are continuously removed during the distillation process. And so a continuous still operates in constant equilibrium. As alcohol is stripped from the wash entering the still, it descends down through the still, and steam that's rising up strips all the alcohol from that beer entering the still on the stripping plates and carries it up into the higher portion of the column. As that steam is going up, the ethanol is then refined on rectification plates that are in the top of the column, which look very similar to the rectification plates you would see in a traditional batch still that has a hybrid column on it. Now, in a continuous column, it separates the ethanol out by temperature. And so in the bottom of the still, it's quite hot. And as you get hot, higher and higher into the still, it gets cooler. And it maintains an equilibrium in the top portion of that still, unlike in a batch still where the temperature gradually creeps up during the distillation as you distill all the alcohol out of it. And so the way in which the parts are separated from the heads and tails is a little different in a column in that we separate them by temperature versus time. When a still is in equilibrium, what ends up happening is that the alcohol on the rectification plate comes off of the plate and depending on the still design, sometimes goes to a doubler or sometimes goes to directly through a condenser and into a parts collection tank. But ultimately, it stays in equilibrium. And so the product that comes off the still on a continuous still is the finished whiskey. It's not a separation of the whole slice of the hearts like you get with a batch still. It's a finished product. And so the taste of the distillate is going to inherently be different coming off a continuous column versus a batch still. In many ways, I've found, though, that operating a continuous column is actually easier than a batch still, given the variables and the inputs and the controls that you have. Ultimately, when a continuous column is running well, it achieves nearly complete separation of the ethanol from the water and the beer, which not only produces clean spirits, but produces clean spirits in a more efficient manner, yielding more alcohol than you'll get out of a batch still. So let's talk a little bit now about how we measure efficiency, because efficiency is so important in consideration to not only this process, but growing your business and getting the most bang for your buck. So when we're measuring efficiency in one way, we ask the question is how to get the most out of your grain, how to get the most proof gallons possible out of every bushel of grain that goes through your distillery to make the most spirits possible. The measurement that we use for this efficiency is proof gallons produced per bushel. In the case of us, that'd be a bushel is measuring its 56 pounds of grain. According to the alcohol textbook, which is a great reference that I would encourage you all to take a look at if you're considering this, the potential proof gallon yield that comes from different types of cereal grains will vary. As you can see here, fine ground corn can yield up to 5.5 proof gallons, coarse grind 5.1, barley 4.8, rye 4.4. Now that's complete proof gallon yield, and with doing the removal of the heads, the amount that you'll get will typically be less than that. And I'd venture to guess those who are doing batch distillation are seeing numbers much lower than that as you're not fully extracting all the ethanol out in batch distillation. So let's talk a little bit about outputs now, a bit more when we look at a continuous versus a batch still. A continuous column can produce over 500 proof gallons of whiskey in a day. It's important to stress that the spirits that come off a continuous column still are typically cleaner. They normally have a little bit less oil and tails in them than they do in batch distillation, depending on when you make your cuts. But the more important thing I've found is that continuous column stills are more consistent because the controls are more set and in place and are less dependent on the taste of the operator on that given day making their cuts. You can produce more consistent spirits on a continuous column than you can day to day running a batch still. And as I've talked a little bit about before, continuous columns are much better at doing actual refining of the ethanol. You'll get more alcohol per batch than you will on a batch still. When we really look at a big picture comparison here, what I've found is that as long as you have the fermentation capacity, which I'm sure as you gathered, you need much larger fermenters to really put a continuous column still to work. Um, you can literally have an output of 5 times that of a batch still, given a day's work, running a continuous column, which will save you a lot of money when it comes to labor. A few of the continuous columns that we've put in. I have this lovely photo here of me starting up the four-side continuous column that we installed at Still Austin Whiskey Company down in Austin, Texas. Um, there's a handful of manufacturers I've worked with over the years that I love to work with. I think they build beautiful, well-functioning columns, and there's a handful of great options out there if you're considering getting one, really no matter where you're at in the world. Forsyth is out of Scotland. It's fantastic to work with. Specific Mechanical builds a really nice column still as well. This here is a column still that we helped start up in Pennsylvania for Pomfret Distillery. They're making some wonderful rye whiskey up there with it now and making a whole lot of it out there running a continuous column. Here's another couple shots that we have. One of that four-side column going in that's still Austin when we build it. And here's a shot of a Vendome that is up in Wyoming, making some wonderful wheated bourbon and rye whiskey. All of these distilleries, what's fantastic about them is they have a very large excess and capacity. And as they've grown their business, they've grown the production and the use of their column stills to meet that demand, as opposed to running up against a ceiling, as I see many smaller distilleries run into running smaller batch stills. So let's talk a little bit now about what the real potential is for a continuous column, like the photos that we just took a look at. Running a continuous column is going to see a drastic reduction in the cost of labor per proof gallon produced. The value and savings that can be had here, I cannot understate. It is so big of a difference what you're going to spend on labor to be making spirits on a column versus a batch still when you need to be making a lot of it. The other potential is the ability to produce. Even a column still as small as 16 inches can produce 1,000 barrels of whiskey a year with still a ton of excess capacity. Having the equipment that you can grow your business into over several years is going to put you in a really good spot to grow as your production allows, as opposed to being limited by what your equipment does for you. The other part that's wonderful about running a column still is you can really start to capitalize on economies of scale. When you're buying entire truckloads of raw grain versus buying super sacks or even buying bagged grain, the cost gets cut down massively per bushel and puts you in a place to where for every barrel of whiskey that you're going to be filling, it's going to cost a lot less for the grain that's going into it. One other really cool thing about continuous columns, and I see quite a few people out there doing this, is that when you have equipment that has a lot of excess capacity, it gives you the opportunity to do contract distillation, which is distilling spirits for other distilleries in your area that maybe don't have excess capacity. This can generate additional income for your business that you might not be able to do otherwise if you're limited by the capacity of your equipment. So let's talk a little bit about safeties and safe operation of a continuous still. Distilling is an inherently dangerous activity. When you're making lots and lots of flammable vapor and flammable liquid, having safeties in place to mitigate those risks is essential to the operation of it. Continuous stills do have similar hazards as batch stills, and so we need those safeties in place to ensure safe operation. Some of those safeties include proper pressure relief valves, overflow and automatic shutoffs if we have failure with a pump or a valve or something not flowing. Having controls that'll stop things from becoming catastrophic is very important. Over temperature controls and the ability to lock out and tag equipment for service are all aspects of safeties that are extremely important. Being able to operate your equipment safely is essential to day-to-day operations, and I'm a big proponent of it to make sure that things can be operated safe. You can teach your people to operate safely and no one gets hurt, and we make lots of delicious whiskey to drink when we're done working, of course. So let's summarize it a little bit. Um, First things first, when you're considering growth, you got to forecast for growth. It's essential to long-term success. If you haven't forecasted, you're missing an opportunity to make better educated decisions to move forward with your business. Batch stills are labor and time intensive. They are very inefficient when it comes to utilizing them for large scale production. Continuous columns, on the other hand, are very efficient. They make the most of energy, they maximize potential yield, and when you need to make large quantities of distilled spirits, a continuous column is without a doubt the right equipment to run, especially with a continuous column and how they produce more consistent spirits, lower cost of materials, lower cost of labors. There are so many reasons that running a continuous column makes more sense, especially once you understand how they work. In that, when you're ready to grow your business, the answer isn't, in most cases, a bigger batch still. It's growing your business with a continuous column. Having the capacity to grow is so valuable. So if you have any questions or comments, we got the Q&A box down there in the bottom. Feel free to type any in, and I'd be more than happy to dive into a few, talk about them, and answer them for you. And if you're jumping on a bit late to this thing, my name is Kris Bohm. I'm the owner of Distilling Now Consulting, a distillery consulting business that helps distilleries new and old grow and expand, put in equipment, and succeed. And so, always happy to lend a hand anywhere I can to folks who need it. Doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending my webinar. Really happy to talk through with you some of my knowledge. I hope you learned a little bit today about continuous distillation that'll help you better educate yourself and those in your business to make the right decision if growing into a continuous column or starting new with one is the right choice for you. And if you're not sure about it still and you want to talk with me about it more, shoot me an email, drop me a line. I'd be more than happy to hop on the phone or meet in person to talk with folks about it and help you consider that option for your business. And I think we're going to stop it right about here. Y'all have a good one. Stay safe.